honor to have a friend of mine here, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister.
When a sitting president of the United States openly suggested that Canada should cease to exist as an independent nation and instead become the 51st state, it triggered a chain reaction that is now reshaping trade flows, consumer behavior, and economic outcomes across North America. At the beginning of the year 2026, the consequences of that political rhetoric are no longer theoretical. They are measurable, visible, and increasingly costly. What began as a series of confrontational statements by President Donald Trump quickly escalated into a broader trade war atmosphere, marked by tariffs, diplomatic strain, and a collapse of trust between two of the most deeply integrated economies in the global economy. But this story is not just about tariffs imposed by governments. It is about a rare and powerful shift driven directly by consumers. Millions of Canadians responded not through protests or legislation, but through their wallets. They reduced purchases of American goods, avoided travel to the United States, and pushed retailers to restructure supply chains away from American suppliers. The result has been a silent but severe economic backlash that Washington did not fully anticipate. The critical question is not whether political tension caused damage. The real question is how deep that damage goes and who ultimately pays the price. And once the numbers are laid bare, the scale of this economic retaliation may shock even the most seasoned observers. Stay with us, because the data reveals a far more unsettling reality. The catalyst for this confrontation was not a tariff schedule or a trade filing. It was political language. When President Donald Trump publicly framed Canada as a threat to national security and went further by suggesting that the country should become the 51st state, the remarks crossed a psychological line that traditional trade disputes rarely reach. In diplomatic terms, such language signals coercion. In economic terms, it injects uncertainty into every cross-border decision, from corporate investment to household spending. For Canada, a nation whose economy is tightly interwoven with the United States, the message was interpreted not as negotiation, but as a challenge to sovereignty. That distinction matters. Trade wars driven by tariffs can be debated, adjusted, or reversed. Trade wars driven by perceived political disrespect tend to harden public attitudes and persist far longer. This rhetoric also provided a justification framework. By labeling allies as security risks, the administration expanded its ability to apply tariffs under national security authorities. Steel, aluminum, energy products, and agricultural goods were suddenly framed not as commercial exchanges, but as strategic liabilities. For Canadian consumers, the implication was clear. Economic engagement with the United States was now entangled with political vulnerability. The immediate impact was psychological before it was financial. Polling in Canada showed rising distrust toward the United States government, even as cultural ties between citizens remained strong. That distrust quickly translated into behavior. Consumers began asking a simple question at checkout counters and travel booking sites. Why spend money in a country whose leadership openly questions your right to exist? That question became the spark, and once ignited, it spread faster than any formal trade policy ever could. What happened next did not come from Parliament or Prime Ministers. It came from shopping carts, liquor aisles, and travel cancellations, and it would soon show up in hard economic data. What followed the political escalation was not an official decree or a coordinated government mandate. It was something far more difficult for policymakers in the United States to predict or control a mass shift in consumer behavior. Across Canada, households began responding to the trade war not with slogans, but with purchasing decisions. Data from Statistics Canada and the United States Census Bureau show a sharp and sustained decline in Canadian imports of American consumer goods throughout the year 2025. Alcoholic beverages were among the first sectors to feel the impact. Canadian retailers reported significant reductions in purchases of American bourbon, wine, and spirits, while domestic producers and non-United States suppliers rapidly filled the gap. In value terms, United States exports of alcoholic beverages to Canada fell dramatically year over year, marking one of the steepest declines in decades. This was not an isolated reaction. Grocery supply chains adjusted as well. Products symbolically associated with the trade dispute, including agricultural goods from politically sensitive regions of the United States, experienced falling shelf space and slower turnover. Retailers responded rationally. If consumers were no longer buying, distributors stopped ordering. Within months, supply contracts were rewritten, and alternative suppliers from Canada and other countries gained permanent footholds. What makes this phase of the trade war particularly significant is that it bypassed traditional levers of control. Tariffs can be negotiated, regulations can be suspended. Consumer sentiment, once hardened, is far more resistant to reversal. In this case, political rhetoric triggered a behavioral response that amplified the economic impact of tariffs without requiring additional policy action. For the United States, the warning signal was clear. The trade war had moved beyond customs checkpoints and into everyday purchasing decisions, where losses accumulate quietly but relentlessly. And if declining product sales were troubling, the next data point would prove even more alarming because the boycott did not stop at store shelves. It spread to an industry worth billions. The most immediate and visible damage from the consumer backlash emerged not in factories or ports, but in airports, hotels, and border crossings. Tourism, one of the most politically sensitive yet economically vital sectors of the United States, became a frontline casualty of the trade war. According to data from the United States Travel Association, international tourism spending in the United States declined sharply during the year 2025. With losses measured in the billions of dollars compared to the previous year. A central driver of that decline was the collapse in Canadian travel. Canadians historically represent the single largest group of foreign visitors to the United States, accounting for more than 1/4 of all international arrivals. When that flow weakened, entire regional economies felt the shock almost immediately. Border states and tourism-dependent towns were hit hardest. Ski resorts, coastal destinations, retail outlets, and hospitality businesses that had relied on predictable Canadian demand reported falling bookings, reduced foot traffic, and declining revenues. In many cases, these were not luxury losses, but existential ones. Small businesses operating on thin margins suddenly faced empty rooms and shortened seasons. What makes this downturn particularly notable is that it coincided with a redirection rather than a disappearance of spending. Canadian travelers did not stop traveling altogether. Instead, they chose domestic destinations or alternative international markets. Money that would have circulated through the United States economy remained north of the border or flowed to other countries, reinforcing the long-term impact of the boycott. For the United States, this represented a double loss. Tourism revenue declined, while associated employment in lodging, food service, and transportation came under pressure. Unlike tariffs, which can be adjusted by policy, lost tourism trust is far harder to restore. And as tourism dollars dried up, the consequences moved from hotel lobbies to payroll departments, where the true cost of the trade war would soon become unavoidable. As the effects of the trade war rippled outward from consumers and tourists, they eventually reached the most sensitive indicator of economic health in the United States: employment. By the end of the year 2025, labor market data began to reflect the cumulative pressure created by falling exports, declining tourism revenue, and weakened consumer demand linked to the boycott. According to reports from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the global outplacement firm Challenger Gray and Christmas, announced layoffs in the United States exceeded 1 million positions during the year, representing a sharp increase compared with the previous year. While not all job losses can be attributed solely to the trade war, analysts consistently identified declining international demand and trade-related uncertainty as key contributing factors across multiple sectors. Industries with direct exposure to Canadian demand were among the most affected. Beverage producers, agricultural exporters, transportation firms, and hospitality-related businesses all faced revenue shortfalls that forced cost-cutting measures. In many cases, companies delayed investment, reduced production schedules, or consolidated operations to offset shrinking cross-border sales. These decisions translated directly into fewer hours worked, hiring freezes, and permanent job cuts. The broader economic implication is difficult to ignore. Job losses reduce household income, weaken consumer spending, and place additional strain on social safety nets. In effect, the trade war created a feedback loop. Political tension reduced trade. Reduced trade, weakened employment, weaker employment further slowed economic activity inside the United States. For policymakers, this moment marked a turning point. Tariffs were initially framed as tools to protect domestic workers. Yet the data increasingly suggested that retaliatory behavior and consumer-driven boycotts were undermining that very objective. The question was no longer whether the strategy carried costs, but whether those costs were being borne disproportionately by American workers. And while employment pressures mounted in the United States, an unexpected contrast was emerging just across the border, one that would challenge assumptions about who was actually winning this trade war. While economic pressure intensified in the United States, Canada was undergoing a rapid and largely unanticipated adjustment. Rather than absorbing the shock of the trade war, the Canadian economy began to reorient itself, accelerating trends that had previously moved at a much slower pace. What started as a political response evolved into a structural economic shift. Data from Statistics Canada indicate that domestic tourism, food processing, and beverage production all recorded notable growth during the year 2025. Spending that once flowed south into the United States was redirected inward, supporting local businesses and regional supply chains. Canadian producers of wine and spirits expanded output to replace American imports, while retailers strengthened long-term contracts with non-United States suppliers. These were not temporary substitutions. Once supply chains adjusted, many firms found little incentive to revert. At the same time, Canada diversified its external trade relationships. Imports of agricultural products from Mexico increased, and trade flows with Europe and parts of Asia gained momentum. In the context of the global economy, this realignment reflected a broader pattern. Countries facing unpredictable tariff regimes from the United States began seeking partners perceived as politically stable and commercially reliable. For the United States, the implications extended beyond the bilateral relationship with Canada. As allies reduced exposure to political risk, American exporters faced a more competitive and less forgiving environment. Market share lost during the trade war proved difficult to recover, even after specific tariffs were eased or lifted. Trust, once disrupted, did not automatically return. This shift highlights a critical lesson. In a trade war, economic outcomes are not determined solely by headline tariffs. They are shaped by long-term decisions made by businesses and consumers seeking stability. And those decisions can quietly redraw the map of global commerce. Which brings us to the final and most uncomfortable question. In this confrontation, did the United States strengthen its economic position, or did it unintentionally weaken it? As the evidence now shows, this trade war did not unfold as a conventional contest of tariffs and counter-tariffs. It evolved into something more complex and far more difficult to reverse. Political rhetoric escalated into economic behavior, and economic behavior reshaped trade flows, employment, and consumer confidence across North America. The sequence is clear. Statements questioning Canada's sovereignty triggered a breakdown in trust. That breakdown translated into a consumer-led boycott that reduced exports, emptied hotels, and weakened labor markets inside the United States. While tariffs were designed to pressure trading partners, the resulting retaliation and market adjustments placed significant strain on American businesses and workers, raising serious questions about strategic effectiveness in the global economy. For Canada, the experience accelerated diversification and reinforced domestic economic resilience. For the United States, it exposed a vulnerability that trade policy alone cannot fix. In an interconnected economy, perception and political stability matter as much as price and access. Once allies begin restructuring supply chains to reduce political risk, the damage extends beyond quarterly trade figures. The central issue now facing Washington is not how to escalate the trade war, but how to contain its long-term consequences. Market share lost to alternative suppliers rarely returns quickly, if it returns at all. Consumer confidence, once broken, is even harder to rebuild. The question that remains is one policymakers can no longer avoid. Is the strategy strengthening the United States or quietly undermining its economic influence? Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis.